Welcome to the Outlier Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Conlin, and before we get started, I want to issue a trigger warning as this podcast episode contains depictions of child abuse. And I should have issued the same trigger warning for the Menendez brothers episodes, as those also contained heavy subject matter involving child abuse. However, all episodes now have trigger warnings as well as resource links in the episode notes. Okay, today's episode, I am going to tell you the story of Jason Vukovich, also known as the Alaskan Avenger or the Pedo Hunter, and why his story is important and relevant. In 2016, Jason Vukovich, aka the Alaskan Avenger, tracked down a number of sex offenders or pedophiles listed on a public registry, and he attacked them with a hammer. Vukovich later said he felt a, quote, overwhelming desire to act because of his own tragic history of abuse at the hands of his adopted father. And I don't just mean beatings, I mean sexual abuse as well. And Vukovich's quest to seek justice for others led him to a very short career as a vigilante. Now, let's go back a bit. Jason Vukovich was sentenced to 28 years in prison on February 26th, 2018, with 5 years suspended. Now, as I see this means he really only has to do 5 years. Now, it is 2024 and he is still in prison, so I will get to that a bit later. And you can consider this episode part 1. Part 2, I have an interview coming up with Jason's sister who is going to explain a lot more, but just keep all of that in the back of your mind. If you have questions, don't worry, they will soon be answered. But yes, Jason Vukovich is still in prison in 2024, and he has since publicly denounced his actions and urged other victims or survivors like him to seek therapy over retribution. Many people consider Vukovich to be a hero and are calling for his release. There are multiple change.org petitions. There's a lot going on in support of Jason Vukovich. And I personally think child sex abuse is unspeakable. And it's one of the, I don't even know how else to describe it. It's hell on earth. So I do think that pedophiles should be punished severely. And that's all I'll say about this for now. But Jason Vukovich is controversial, and I want to go back and give you a bit of a history about his life and essentially how he got to this point. Jason Vukovich was born in Anchorage, Alaska on June 25th, 1975, to a single mother. And Jason was later adopted by his mother's new husband, Larry Lee Fulton. But instead of being this great father that Jason Vukovich desperately needed, Fulton became his abuser. Jason once stated in an interview, quote, "Both of my parents were dedicated Christians and had us in church every service available, 2 or 3 each week. So you can imagine the horror and confusion I experienced when this man who adopted me began using late night, quote, prayer sessions to molest me," end quote. That is so horrible and sad. But in addition to sexual abuse, Larry Lee Fulton also used violence against Vukovich, and he beat Jason with pieces of wood and whipped him with belts. And years later, at Vukovich's trial, his brother Joel testified about what they had suffered as young boys. And Joel said that they'd roll over on the bunk beds and be up against the wall, and it's so heartbreaking. Joel said it was his job to go first, so Larry Lee Fulton would hopefully leave Jason alone. And Larry Lee Fulton was charged with second-degree abuse of a minor in 1989, but he served no jail time at all. And according to Jason and Joel, no one ever came to check in on the family after that. The physical abuse and the sexual abuse that Joel and Jason were experiencing was horrific. So at age 16, Jason and Joel ran away from home. And Jason was still underage. He moved to Washington State. He had no ID. He had no money, nothing. So he essentially turned to thievery to survive, and he built quite a rap sheet for himself. And he admitted that his descent into crime was really just part of this cycle of confusion, self-hatred, and things that just go through your brain when you have experienced something as traumatic as child sex abuse. You just think that you don't matter and that nothing you do matters. So this makes sense to me why he turned to crime. He said, quote, "My silent understanding was that I was worthless, a throwaway. The foundations laid in my youth never went away," end quote. And Jason Vukovich had a criminal record at this point spanning from Washington and Oregon to Idaho, Montana, California. He was just traveling all around. And then by 2008, he moved back to Alaska. And he also racked up quite a few criminal charges in Alaska as well, but nothing crazy or violent. It was theft and possession of a controlled substance. And this really seems to be from his untreated childhood trauma just reaching this boiling point. And I'm obviously not a doctor, but I do feel like this really contributed to why his life was turning out the way that it was and why he was making certain decisions that he was. So, in 2016, Jason began to read through the Sex Offender Registry of Alaska, and then he decided to get his own kind of justice. In June of 2016, Jason sought out 3 men to start who were listed in the Alaskan Sex Offender Registry for crimes related to children. So he had this notebook filled with names and addresses that he found on the public index. So Jason Vukovich targeted the homes of Charles Albee, Andre Barbosa, and Wesley Demarest, all pedophiles, essentially. So the quote-unquote Alaskan Avenger first knocked on Albee's door the morning of June 24th, 2016. He basically pushed the man inside his home, his own home, and he's 68 years old, by the way, Charles Albee. And Jason Vukovich ordered Albee to sit on his bed, and Jason slapped him across the face aggressively quite a few times and told him that he'd found his address on the sex offender website, and he knew just what Charles Albee was doing and had done. He knew just how sick he was. Then Vukovich just robbed him and left. But 2 days later, he used the same type of method where he knocked on the door and shoved the person. He used this same method to enter Andre Barbosa's home. So he knocks, he shoves Andre, but this time he didn't do it during the day. He did it at 4 a.m. and he brought 2 female accomplices. And then he threatened the, this time, 25-year-old registered pedophile with a hammer. And Jason told Andre to sit down, and then he punched him in the face before warning him that he would, quote, bash his dome in. And a bail memo revealed later that Jason stated he was there to, quote, collect what Barbosa had owned, and one of the 2 women that he was with filmed the incident while Jason and the other woman robbed and stole several items from Barbosa, including his truck. So that was the second incident. Now, the third time that Jason Vukovich went after one of the targets, he seemed to escalate things. And this was Wesley Demarest. So Wesley heard someone breaking into his home around 1 a.m., and this was Jason Vukovich, and he had knocked on the door and then forced himself inside. And according to Demarest, he recalls Jason telling him to lay down on his bed. And Demarest said no. And then Jason said, get on your knees. And Damaris said that he said no. And then he remembers that Jason got violent with him, and then he struck him in the face with a hammer. And during the assault, Vukovich allegedly told his victim, Wesley Damaris, I'm an avenging angel. I'm going to mete out justice for the people you hurt. And after this, Jason stole an assortment of items, including a laptop, and he fled. So Wesley Damaris, after this, after being struck by a hammer pretty violently, he woke up a few hours later in his own blood, and he called the police. And it didn't take long for authorities to find their perpetrator, who was Jason Vukovich, sitting in his Honda Civic nearby with a hammer with blood, stolen goods, and a notebook containing the names of the 3 assault victims. He was arrested on the spot and later charged with 18 counts of assault, robbery, burglary, and theft. And initially he pled not guilty, but he opted to make a deal with the prosecution instead that I think was very, very smart. He pled guilty to first-degree attempted assault and a consolidated count of first-degree robbery, and in exchange, prosecutors dismissed over a dozen additional charges. And this led to his sentence in 2018 of 28 years in prison, but 5 years suspended and another 5 on probation. So what this essentially means to me, and I will clarify, but based on the law, he really could serve only 5 years and then be on probation for 5 years. But if he does anything to mess up within that 5 years, he goes directly back to prison, no questions asked. And he wrote a letter in 2017 to the Anchorage Daily News, and he clarified his brutal motivations and his regrets. And I'm going to read you that letter as well, so you can just kind of hear what was going on in Jason's head. And in 2020, he appealed his sentence on the grounds that his PTSD should have been considered as a mitigating factor in the case. But he did lose that bid in October of 2020. And I had mentioned that he does have this hero status with many people in Alaska, but that judge in particular ruled, quote unquote, vigilantism won't be accepted in our society, end quote. And I also want to add that when Jason said he would plead guilty to the assaults in 2016, he said on one condition that his sentence be no longer than the combined prison terms of his 3, quote-unquote, alleged victims. He wanted to make sure that he did not serve a day longer than any of them served for their unspeakable crimes that they committed against children. And this is a really controversial conversation to have, or at least I feel like. I know that I have done some episodes on the Menendez brothers because these brothers are trying to, do anything they can at this point to get a new trial, to appeal their sentence, to get exonerated, or just get out of jail based on the fact that their charges should have been manslaughter in their opinion and in the opinion of many people in the public because they were acting in imperfect self-defense. Their parents were, or their father anyway, was molesting them and they couldn't take it anymore. So again, this is a tough conversation to have, but Jason Vukovich's attorney, Ember Tilton, has been very vocal and shares the views of thousands of others who have pledged their support for Jason on these petition sites pleading for his release. Because to Ember Tilton and all of these people, the cycle of violence and trauma is unlikely to end by keeping victims turned criminals in jail. And Ember Tilton stated, quote, "I don't think he needs to be punished. He's already been punished. This whole thing started out as the punishment of a child who didn't deserve to be treated this way," end quote. But once again, Jason Vukovich has urged others who have been victims of childhood sex abuse to seek inner peace and therapy and reject vigilante justice. Quote from Jason, I began my life sentence many, many years ago. It was handed down to me by an ignorant, hateful, poor substitute as a father. I now face losing most of the rest of my life due to a decision to lash out at people like him. To all those who have suffered like I have, love yourself and those around you. This is truly the only way forward. End quote. And that was from Jason. And I'm going to go ahead and end the show by reading his 5-page letter that he wrote to the Anchorage Daily News in 2017. And this really is heartbreaking and explains a lot. But for my next interview, the part 2, I will be speaking with Jason's sister, Angelina, and she'll give me a better idea about his sentence and how he really is technically set to be released any day now. And again, I don't know all the details, but I know that there is good news here. And Angelina will explain all of that on the next episode. And you can also check the episode notes on ways how to contact Jason, how to provide money for his commissary, and how to just view his story and see what he has done to rehabilitate himself since 2016. But without further ado, let me read Jason's letter to the Anchorage Daily News from 2017, and then I will close us out. An open letter to the community. I am writing today in an attempt to correct a poor message I sent last fall in the form of a plea offer via a letter to the Alaska Dispatch News. In that letter, I suggested that my sentence should be no longer than those served by my victims and my abuser. That suggestion resonated with many people in the public, but I write to correct that sentiment now. There is no place for vigilante justice in an ordered society, and I want to deter others that find themselves in a similar position as I found myself in the summer of 2016. To those who understand how it feels to live through abuse and carry it with you, let me share my story in an effort to prevent its repetition. I was born here in Anchorage in 1975. My father adopted me around the age of 4. Both of my parents were dedicated Christians and had us in every church service available, 2 or 3 each week. So you can imagine the horror and confusion I experienced when this man who adopted me began using the late night prayer sessions to molest me. Also, he beat me with a custom-made 2x4. I recall the scribed handle with wrapped tape to protect his hands. He preferred to use a 2-handed grip and beat me between my butt and the backs of my knees. These beatings were quite frequent, and some days it was so difficult to just stand upright. My older brother ran away from home at some point, and I was devastated that he would abandon me with these people. He was eventually arrested as a runaway and decided to tell the police the truth. As a result of the investigation, they charged and later convicted my adoptive father, Larry Lee Fulton, of second-degree abuse of a minor. I was ashamed to recall the sessions when I was questioned privately by the prosecutor for some reason, so I lied and downplayed the abuse. I remember that my family had decided my brother was wrong to have gone to the police and that he shouldn't have told anyone. I can attest that ultimately it didn't really matter what was said or done. His plea deal gave him a suspended sentence, not one single day in jail for beating and molesting his children. Immediately after this occurred, they pulled me out of school, sold our house in Anchorage, and moved us out to a completely different part of Alaska. There I was placed in homeschool, and the isolation was complete. The state of Alaska did 0 follow-ups, no periodic check-ins, no mandatory counseling for any children involved, nothing. I was 13 or 14 when my brother ran away, and by the time I was about 16, I couldn't take the beatings anymore, and I began thinking of running away. And I had always been a hard worker. whether it was commercial fishing, working for hunting guides, bagging groceries at Safeway, but no amount of work could keep me away from home all the time. So I began saving whatever money I could. After climbing out my bedroom window one night, I came back the next day to retrieve my belongings. I found what they were allowing me to keep in trash bags on the front porch. They withheld my driver's license and social security card, and I recall my mother saying, quote, "They didn't want to facilitate my flight into sin." I was trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and the torments of home, so I flew to Spokane, Washington. I found work easily in Spokane, but I learned soon that I wouldn't be paid without a state ID. So I was hungry and desperate and thousands of miles from my hometown. I looked for money wherever I could take it. Health clubs, gyms, I began stealing from lockers, and about 5 months after arriving in Washington, police arrested me for theft and forging checks. I was then introduced to my first stint in juvenile hall. And 9 months later, I was out, but soon returned for similar crimes. Most of all, though, I feared being sent home, but it never came up. Being a thief and a liar fit nicely with my lack of self-worth, my silent understanding that I was a worthless throwaway. The foundations laid in my youth never went away. They simply remained hidden, and everything I chose to do was built on those thoughts and feelings from the past. I had started down a long, winding path of deception and self-abuse. I became a full-time, regular pot smoker to try and dull the painful effects of my upbringing. I attempted to hold regular jobs and was successful for periods of time, but without any support system or real family circle to relate to, I continually made poor choices that cost me. At 18, I was arrested for driving without a license. This happened about 8 times over the next 2 to 3 years, and each time I would spend a month in prison, each time a little longer than the last. But by age 20, I had spent roughly half of my adult life in jail. Moving from city to city in the lower 48 became the norm for me. I followed the construction jobs wherever they led and lived only for the moment. If a project ended and I was laid off, I wouldn't hesitate to steal to support myself. This behavior continued, and as I matured, never saving money or planning for tomorrow, I existed only in the moment. Time and again, my choices reflect a lack of concern for myself and others, and many, many nights I simply wanted to die. 10 years ago, I decided to move back to Alaska, and I wanted to start over and live free in my home state. Maybe I could settle down and find some happiness in this beautiful place. I managed to do well until I lost my slope job again. I stole some credit cards again, and I got myself sent to prison for a 6-year sentence. Upon my release, I intended to live quietly, enjoy my freedom, and try to find satisfaction in the little things. This was short-lived. I soon violated my parole, and I was arrested for eluding. I served 3 more years in prison for that offense, and this now takes us to the summer of 2016. I was living simply, taking joy and satisfaction in the basics. Little things like grocery shopping and mowing the lawn and pulling weeds, they brought me great happiness. But I began to hear things in the community. Kids being molested. Rumors of men abusing their positions in authority to take advantage of children. I thought back to my experiences as a child, and I felt this overwhelming desire to act. I took matters into my own hands, and I assaulted 3 pedophiles. In one instance, upon breaking into the home, the man immediately began punching me, and I reached for a weapon, a hammer, and I fractured his skull. I regret that deeply, And I'm sorry I took things that far. It was never my intention for someone to be that seriously injured. I want my story to serve as a deterrent. My choices led me to where I currently sit, looking at 20 years in prison. And if you've already lost your youth like me due to a child abuser, please do not throw away your present and your future by committing acts of violence. There are many kind and loving things we can do to protect children. We must be patient and respect the law and hope that someday those of us who have been cast aside will be remembered. Please do not act out like I did. Cherish your own life and freedom, and learn from my story and seek peace, not retribution. If you hear of someone abusing children in your neighborhood, or if you want to take matters into your own hands, please call someone who loves you and talk it out. I offer all of you this view of my life in the hope that I will help people avoid the pitfalls and the traps that I walked into. I began my life sentence many, many years ago. It was handed down to me by an abuser, by a hateful, poor substitute for a father. To all those who have experienced what I have, love yourself and those around you. This is truly the only way forward. There is time left for you to avoid my predicament, but for me, I will face a sentence dictated by the law. The course of my life is now inextricably intertwined with the operation of state law. Though I have been resentful of this in the past, I now accept it as the only legitimate way that civilized people should regulate conduct and maintain order. On December 13th, when I am sentenced, I will accept as fair whatever sentence my judge imposes. I urge anyone who reads this to engage the proper channels to effect positive change. Do not glamorize my actions. Believe me when I say there is nothing glamorous about my life now. Sincerely, Jason Vukovich, Anchorage Correctional Center, Anchorage, Alaska. End quote. That was so sad, so troubling, and again, it just reminds me a lot of the Menendez brothers. Being a victim or a survivor of child abuse is already a life sentence. I cannot imagine what it does to your brain or your psyche, especially if you don't have a support system around you, if you don't have someone to talk to or someone to help you. So I am very anxious to talk to Jason's sister and get an update. And like I said, this is a controversial story and a controversial case, but I think that the story needs to be told. So thank you for listening. I will be back with part 2. And if you are so inclined, please do leave me a review or just write me a nice little note wherever you listen, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. I would so appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for listening. I'm Lauren Conlin.